Welcome to Past People. To support my channel, please consider subscribing. The tumultuous life of King George IV. Born into the lap of opulence as the heir to the royal throne, surpassed the bounds of excess in an unparalleled manner. His actions, characterized by depravity, cruelty, and obscenity, stand out even in the context of the English monarchy. This narrative delves into the murky family secrets and the conclusion of this royal fate. Lavishly indulged childhood. George, born on the 12th of August 1762, was the firstborn to King George III and Queen Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. Despite his apparent charmed life, replete with regal privileges and extravagant feasts, the royal family concealed a dark and corrupt essence beneath the glittering facade. His father, King George III, earned the moniker the Mad King due to the recurring bouts of insanity. This condition necessitated George's assumption of the role of Prince Regent, marking the advent of the Regency period. Juggling this weighty responsibility might offer insight into the spectacular mismanagement that ensued. As George IV's reign concluded, his senior aide, chronicling the monarch in a private diary, spared no criticism. A more contemptible, cowardly, selfish, unfeeling dog does not exist. There have been good and wise kings, but not many of them, and this I believe to be one of the worst. Brace yourselves for a tumultuous journey through his legacy. Early on, Prince George exhibited unmistakable signs of debauchery. His numerous mistresses could likely have filled multiple royal chambers, and his penchant for revelry and carousing with these beauties surpassed his interest in politics and sermons. The extent of his transgressions, however, exceeded all predictions. Gambling ranked among George's great passions, but this infatuation didn't reciprocate. It nearly led to his downfall. Despite his considerable royal wealth, George amassed colossal debts from extravagant wagers on cards, horses, and practically anything with a price tag. Eventually, the repercussions caught up with him in a spectacular fashion. As any newcomer to university life can attest, indulging in brandies may enhance your social standing, but is decidedly unkind to your belt buckle. George, always carrying a bit of extra weight, saw his extravagant taste swiftly propel him into epic dimensions. In due course, his refined womanizing earned him the noteworthy and amusing title, the Fat Adonis. George's father, in a desperate attempt to steer his son in the right direction, devised a disconcerting solution. Before considering the forgiveness of any of Prince George's debts, the king insisted on his marriage to his cousin, Princess Caroline of Brunswick. If this appears to be a perilous and dreadful plan, it undeniably was. Caroline, in her mid-20s, faced an unusually advanced age for women to marry at that time. Some attributed it to her strict parents, who prohibited her from attending balls or, God forbid, dancing at any of those galas, and even peculiarly banned her from standing near windows. However, according to others, there was an even darker reason for Caroline's delayed romances. A persistent and notorious rumour suggested that Princess Caroline of Brunswick remained unmarried due to unconventional behaviour. Whispers of the time implied that when Caroline was in her teens, she became pregnant by a peasant. To conceal the pregnancy, Caroline's parents rejected several proposals before ultimately marrying her off. Perhaps George had heard that rumour too. Prince George and Caroline of Brunswick had never set eyes on each other before agreeing to wed, leading to a disastrous encounter. Reportedly, when Prince George finally encountered his betrothed, his response was incredibly snide. The future monarch simply requested a larger glass of drink to numb his disappointment. Painful, but that wasn't even the worst part. Upon Caroline's initial arrival in England, George reportedly made a gesture of apparent honour by appointing her a lady-in-waiting, Frances Villiers. However, this turned out to be a cruel power play. Villiers was one of George's preferred mistresses, and by designating her as Caroline's Lady of the Bedchamber, he unmistakably communicated his priorities to his new wife. The narrative, however, did not conclude at this juncture. George's ineptitude in governing a nation contrasted sharply with his adeptness in the realm of fashion. Introducing various styles to England, many of them strategically designed to conceal his obesity, he abandoned the prevailing knee breeches in favour of looser trousers. Dark colours became popular under his influence, serving to create a slimming effect, and high collars were embraced to conceal his double chin. The royal union unfolded on the 9th of April 1795, but the fairy tale ceremony swiftly devolved into a nightmarish affair. Prince George commenced his drinking early, rendering himself thoroughly intoxicated by the time the ceremony commenced. He also voraciously declared to friends that Caroline was unsightly and unhygienic, and this was just the beginning, as they still had the wedding night ahead of them. When Prince George escorted Caroline to the bedchamber that fateful night, he made a horrific revelation. Upon assessing the situation, he strongly suspected that the blushing bride was not a virgin. While this lends some credence to the unsavouring pregnancy rumours surrounding Caroline, it's worth noting that George himself had not exactly spent his youth showing chastity. The bedroom dynamics between George and Caroline mirrored the dismal state of their overall relationship. The prince later asserted that they consummated their union a mere 3 times, twice on the wedding night, once the following evening, and thereafter never again. Despite his proclivity for womanizing, George penned, "It required no small effort to conquer my aversion and overcome the disgust of her person. Sometimes, however, 3 times is all it takes." Almost precisely 9 months after their ill-fated wedding night, Caroline gave birth to a daughter, Princess Charlotte. It's almost as if Caroline's biology was vehemently signalling "one and done" regarding her tumultuous marriage. Ultimately, Charlotte stood as the sole legitimate child that George would ever have, rendering her subsequent tragedy all the more poignant. Despite his questionable pursuits, George IV harboured an unexpected talent, an incredible, witty and intelligent individual from childhood. Even those who despised him acknowledged his brilliance as a conversationalist, provided he wasn't excessively inebriated. However, his biting wit occasionally veered towards the inappropriate. Prepare yourself, as the saga of George IV is about to take an even more astonishing turn. While George and Caroline of Brunswick endured a miserable marriage, she remained oblivious to his darkest secret. On the day they exchanged vows, the prince was already married, and the scandal surrounding this revelation proved even more sensational than it initially sounds. Before Princess Caroline became his means of royal debt forgiveness, George IV was passionately entwined with Maria Fitzherbert, a double gasp, widowed, Catholic commoner, 6 years his senior. George, deeply infatuated, pledged to marry none but her. It might have been considered romantic if it didn't take such a twisted turn. In a clandestine ceremony on the 15th of December 1785, George secretly wed Maria at the bride's modest dwelling. If this sounds dubious, it's because it was. Decades earlier, Parliament had enacted laws making it impossible for a royal heir to marry a Catholic and requiring the king's permission for any marriage. In essence, George and Maria were in a bind. Nevertheless, they forged ahead. George IV concealed his sham marriage for years, fully aware that its revelation could ruin him and both Parliament and his father, potentially jeopardizing his throne. Nevertheless, both he and Maria regarded the union as legitimate, and she remained a significant figure in his life until the very end. As Caroline soon discovered, perhaps a bit too significant. In the realm of mistresses, George IV undeniably had a preference: mature women. Maria Fitzherbert was a woman of maturity. yet she paled in comparison to George's other paramour. Frances Villiers was 40 and already a grandmother when George initiated an affair with her in his early 30s. In fact, most of George's mistresses were witty, charismatic women many years his senior. Prince George struggled to navigate his love life, mirroring the chaos in his political realm. With King George III's escalating mental illness, Parliament advocated for Prince George to assume the role of regent as early as 1788, when he was still in his 20s. However, for some reason, most members of Parliament mistrusted the royal rake, and his ascent to power only occurred amid great tragedy. In 1810, a devastating blow struck the royal family. Prince George's younger sister, Amelia, succumbed at the age of 27. She had been King George III's beloved daughter, and her demise plunged him into melancholy beyond description. Heartbreakingly, it also marked the final stage of the king's debilitating mental illness. At that point, Parliament had no alternative but to appoint his son as regent. Predictably, the tumultuous relationship between Caroline and Prince George faltered after the birth of their obligatory heir, Princess Charlotte. However, George's ordeal was only beginning. To his surprise, Caroline garnered significant public favour, and when news of their marital woes reached the press, they portrayed her as a wronged wife, which in many respects she was. But after that, all pretences were abandoned. The brief period during which Caroline and George coexisted felt like an eternity of ceaseless torment. Frances Villiers, George's current mistress, took her role as Lady of the Bedchamber quite seriously. She delved into Caroline's private correspondence and aided George in exerting control over his new wife. The prince went so far as to deny Caroline the freedom to travel without his permission, and matters were about to take a darker turn. By 1797, Caroline had established a separate residence far from George, until scandal erupted. Whispers circulated that the king's wife was entertaining gentlemen callers during her newfound independence, prompting Parliament to launch the infamous delicate investigation into her private affairs. The findings were far from delicate. George immersed himself in the creme de la creme of English society, treating leisure with a gravity akin to an actual occupation, which it wasn't. Under his regency and reign, the concept of a seaside vacation gained prominence, thanks in part to George IV constructing his own seaside spa and palace in the Brighton Pavilion. Although the delicate investigation failed to conclusively prove anything against Caroline, it unearthed a trove of damning information, including suggestions of a secret love child born during her time apart from George. This provided George with ample ammunition for a ruthless retaliation. Consequently, he restricted Caroline's access to her daughter, Charlotte, to once-a-week visits. Why didn't Prince George follow in the footsteps of King Henry VIII and seek a divorce from Caroline? Well, he certainly tried. However, being just as culpable as her in matters of infidelity, any divorce proceedings would inevitably expose his own indiscretions. Despite attempting to push through a bill allowing him to separate from Caroline without investigation, it crashed and burned due to the widespread disdain from Parliament. Prince George associated with the most sophisticated circles during the Regency period, including the renowned dandy Beau Brummel. Possessing a razor-sharp wit and an even sharper tailor, the vivacious Brummel played a pivotal role in keeping the Prince Regent at the forefront of both fashion and revelry. However, the camaraderie eventually soured. During a ball, the Prince Regent, in a fit of pique, chose to ignore Brummel cruelly. In retaliation, Brummel elevated the snub to new heights. Right in George's presence, the dandy turned to a companion and rudely remarked, "Who's your fat friend?" This marked the end of their once warm-hearted and congenial friendship. In 1820, after the passing of Mad King George, Prince George ascended to the throne at the age of 57. It was his moment to shine, and he spared no expense to his opulent coronation. Describing it as lavish falls short. Party George's grand celebration incurred a cost 20 times higher than his father's coronation, which was also a staggering 10,000 British pounds. Small wonder why the American colonies grew so resentful of taxes. Credit where it's due, George IV possessed exquisite taste, albeit ruinously expensive. For his coronation, he insisted that all attendees don old-timey Tudor and Stuart period attire, even commissioning his own decadent red velvet gown. It became a resounding success, used in every coronation since George V. However, his special day was not without its share of high drama. George IV's pettiness knew no bounds, and he adamantly excluded Caroline from the coronation. When she returned to London to assert her rights as consort, George inflicted a cruel blow. Caroline reached the doors of Westminster Abbey, only to be met by guards brandishing bayonets under the Queen's chin before slamming the doors shut, and the ordeal didn't end there. To compound Caroline's royal humiliation, King George IV issued an official decree to expunge her name from the Common Book of Prayer at the coronation ceremony. To George, this likely felt like the culmination of his petty revenge against Caroline. Little did he know what lay ahead. Despite the persistent allegations of infidelity shadowing Caroline of Brunswick, she asserted that she had committed adultery only once in her life, with the husband of Mrs. Fitzherbert, the king. Caroline wasn't holding back. In the tumultuous aftermath of King George IV's coronation, the narrative takes a darker turn as we delve into the tragic and mysterious fate of his estranged queen, Caroline. Amid health challenges and personal tribulations, the monarch's life becomes a tapestry woven with suspicion, addiction, and an undignified demise. Following the coronation, a distraught Queen Caroline returned home and promptly fell gravely ill. Her condition steadily deteriorated, and 3 weeks later she succumbed at the age of 53. While her doctors initially diagnosed an intestinal obstruction, modern experts suggest it might have been cancer. However, Caroline harboured a much bleaker theory. During her final days, Caroline often deliriously claimed that she had been poisoned, a rumour that many at the time denied. Many inferred George's involvement in his wife's demise, though there is no concrete evidence supporting this theory. Nevertheless, the sentiment persisted. Upon ascending to the throne in 1820, George concealed his most disturbing behaviour yet. According to numerous historians, the monarch likely grappled with an addiction to the sedative laudanum. One undeniable fact was that George's morbid obesity, a condition that would play a role in his awkward downfall. In the twilight of his life, George faced a myriad of ailments, including dropsy, gout, arteriosclerosis, and severe cataracts that left him nearly blind. Virtually incapacitated, George had to endorse bills using a stamped signature in front of witnesses, far from the image of absolute power. In the waning years of his life, people begrudgingly admired King George IV, but for all the wrong reasons. Despite battling severe illness, he displayed an astonishing will to live and maintained an unabated appetite. In one memorable meal, he consumed a pigeon, a beef pie, over a bottle of wine, a glass of champagne, and a glass of brandy. One of the very few entirely complimentary nicknames bestowed upon George was the First Gentleman of England. People used this moniker to encapsulate his charm, wit, and cultural refinement, while conveniently overshadowing the less savoury aspects of his personality. On the 26th of June 1830, George IV faced his demise, and it was anything but serene. At 3 a.m, George awoke with an urgent need for a bowel movement, resulting in a large evacuation mixed with blood. The king immediately grasped the severity of the situation, realizing it was worse than he could ever have imagined. Summoning his doctor with urgency, George exclaimed, "Fetch him, this is death." However, the physician barely had time to enter the room before the king passed away. The doctor later recounted, "I was up in the stairs in 5 minutes, and he died but 8 minutes afterwards." The swift turn of events left everyone bewildered. The autopsy, however, unravelled the unsettling truth. Examination results disclosed that the king succumbed to a ruptured blood vessel in his stomach, embarrassingly occurring during a bowel movement. Yet that was not the sole revelation. The autopsy revealed an enlarged heart, a bladder tumour the size of an orange, and dangerously congested heart valves. Contrary to the expectation of a nation mourning King George IV, the response was quite the opposite. As one commentator expressed, "There never was an individual less regretted by his fellow creatures than this deceased king. What eye has wept for him? What heart has heaved one throb of unmercenary sorrow? Well, now I feel conflicted about feeling sorry for him." Despite banning Queen Caroline from his coronation, George's cruelest act didn't end there. In 1817, their only daughter, Princess Charlotte, died in childbirth, and George intentionally withheld this devastating news from his estranged wife. Shockingly, Caroline learned of the tragic event accidentally through a passing courier. Quite a despicable revelation. After the birth of George's daughter, Princess Charlotte, he promptly revised his last will and testament, leaving his royal wife a disturbing gift. 3 days post Charlotte's birth, George updated his will, bequeathing all his possessions to Maria Fitzherbert, "my wife," while allocating Caroline a mere single shilling. Now that's an unsettling bequest. Despite George's spendthrift ways, romantic escapades, and indulgence, his regency and reign proved to be an unmitigated disaster. Some historians propose a more unsettling reason for his failures. George may have suffered from the same illness that afflicted his father, porphyria. Regardless of the cause, the final years of his reign were far from picturesque. As we conclude this riveting exploration of King George IV's tumultuous reign, we are left with a nuanced understanding of a monarch whose life was marred by excesses, personal tribulations, and a legacy overshadowed by controversy. From the suspicion surrounding Queen Caroline's demise to the monarch's struggles with addiction and a tragic neglect of familial ties, the tale of George IV is one of complexity and contradiction.